March 8, 1971. Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier. 20,000 people packed into the arena. Frank Sinatra was there taking photographs for Life magazine. Dustin Hoffman, Woody Allen, Diana Ross, Bill Cosby, every celebrity, every politician, every power player in New York wanted to be ringside for this fight. And sitting in the fifth row, directly behind the judges, wearing the $50,000 chinchilla fur coat and a matching chinchilla hat, was Frank Lucas. Next to him sat his wife, Julie, dripping in diamonds. They looked like royalty. Frank's coat was so extravagant, so ostentatious, that cameras kept panning to him. People whispered, pointed, wondered who this black man was sitting ringside like he owned the world. Across the arena in the nosebleed sections sat a team of federal agents, DEA, NYPD detectives, organized crime task force. They were there to watch the fight like everyone else. But one detective, Richie couldn't stop staring at Frank Lucas. He didn't know his name yet, didn't know what he did, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nobody sits ringside at the fight of the century wearing a $50,000 fur coat unless they're making serious, illegal money. That coat, that one decision to be seen, to be somebody, to show the world that Frank Lucas had arrived, that single moment of vanity destroyed everything Frank had spent 5 years building. This is the story of how the smartest drug dealer in America made the dumbest mistake of his life, and how one fur coat brought down a $1 million per day empire. To understand why this was such a catastrophic error, you need to understand Frank Lucas's entire strategy, his whole philosophy, the thing that separated him from every other drug dealer in Harlem: invisibility. Frank Lucas built his empire on one principle: stay invisible. While Nicky Barnes was on the cover of New York Times Magazine calling himself Mr. Untouchable, Frank was wearing off-the-rack suits from Macy's. While other dealers were buying Rolls-Royces and Ferraris, Frank drove a Chevy. While they threw parties at nightclubs, Frank stayed home with his family. He learned this from Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy always said, "The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room." Frank took that lesson to heart. His Blue Magic operation was making him $1 million a day, every single day. He had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but nobody knew his name. Not the feds, not the NYPD, not even most people in Harlem. The Italian mafia knew someone was cutting into their territory, flooding the market with pure heroin, undercutting their prices, but they didn't know who. They were looking for a big operation, multiple people, maybe another family moving in. They weren't looking for a quiet country boy from North Carolina who'd figured out how to bypass them entirely. Frank's system was brilliant. He went directly to Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, met with suppliers in Thailand, used contacts in the military to smuggle heroin back to the United States in the coffins of dead American soldiers. Nobody checked the coffins. Nobody questioned them. They came back with full military honors, were received by grieving families, and somewhere in that chain, Frank's people extracted the product. It was genius, and it was completely invisible. His distribution network was family, literally, his brothers, his cousins, people he could trust, people who wouldn't talk, no outsiders, no weak links. He cut the heroin himself, packaged it himself in blue tape, that's why they called it Blue Magic, controlled every step of the process. And most importantly, he stayed out of sight. While other dealers were getting arrested, getting killed, getting famous, Frank Lucas was getting rich. For 5 years, it worked perfectly. The feds had no idea who he was. They were chasing shadows, following the Italian families, wiretapping the traditional suppliers, looking in all the wrong places. Frank could have kept going for decades, could have retired a billionaire, could have died in his sleep, surrounded by family, with nobody ever knowing what he'd done. But on March 8, 1971, everything changed. Because Frank Lucas made one mistake. He let his ego win. The fur coat wasn't spontaneous. Frank had been thinking about it for weeks. His wife Julie wanted to go to the Ali-Frazier fight. Everyone was talking about it, the biggest sporting event in history. She wanted to be there, wanted to experience it, wanted to be part of something legendary. Frank got tickets, ringside. Cost him $1,000 each. Not a problem. He made that in minutes. But Julie said something that got into Frank's head. Everyone's going to be dressed up, all the celebrities, all the rich people. I don't want to look out of place. Frank heard that, and something shifted. For 5 years, he'd been invisible, deliberately, strategically. But a part of him, the part that grew up poor in North Carolina, the part that watched his cousin get murdered by the Klan, the part that had been powerless and invisible for all the wrong reasons, that part wanted to be seen. Wanted people to know that Frank Lucas had made it, that he was somebody, that he belonged in those seats as much as Frank Sinatra or any white millionaire. So, he bought the coat. Chinchilla, the most expensive fur in the world, custom-made, $50,000, equivalent to about $350,000 today. He wore it with a matching hat. Julie wore diamonds. They looked incredible, like movie stars, like royalty. When they walked into Madison Square Garden, people stared. Security guards straightened up. Ushers treated them with deference. Other celebrities nodded in acknowledgement. Frank felt it. That recognition, that respect. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible because he was powerless. He was invisible by choice. And now, he was choosing to be seen. It felt good, felt right, felt like validation for everything he'd accomplished. He sat down ringside. The fight started. Ali and Frazier went to war for 15 rounds, one of the greatest fights in boxing history. Frank was there, front row, living history. He was so caught up in the moment, in the spectacle, in the feeling of having arrived, that he didn't notice the detective in Section 304. Didn't notice Richie Roberts with binoculars, watching him instead of the fight. Didn't notice that his picture was being taken, that his face was being documented, that the question was being asked, who is that? Richie Roberts was an honest cop in a corrupt department. That alone made him unusual. He'd once found $1 million in unmarked bills in a criminal's car and turned it all in. His fellow cops thought he was crazy, or stupid, or both. But Richie had a gift. He could smell dirty money, could spot the tells, the overconfidence, the carelessness that came with getting away with crime for too long. And when he saw Frank Lucas in that fur coat, sitting ringside, he knew. The next morning, Richie started digging, asked around, showed Frank's picture to informants, to street cops, to detectives in Harlem. Nobody knew him. A few people had seen him around, but nobody knew his name. No arrests, no record, no intelligence files. That made Richie even more interested, because if you're making the kind of money that gets you ringside at the fight of the century in a $50,000 fur coat, but nobody knows your name, you're not just a criminal, you're a smart criminal, and smart criminals are the most dangerous. Richie formed a task force, started surveillance, followed Frank, watched his movements, his associates, his family. It took months. Frank was careful, paranoid, changed routes, used counter-surveillance, made it hard. But the damage was done. Frank was on their radar now, and once you're on the radar, it's only a matter of time. Frank didn't know any of this, went about his business, made his money, lived his life. The fur coat was in his closet. He never wore it again, but the consequences of that one night kept building. Richie's team identified Frank's brothers, his cousins, started wiretapping their phones, following their cars, building a case piece by piece. They tracked shipments, noted patterns, connected dots. In 1973, 2 years after the fight, they identified Frank's connection in Southeast Asia, started working with military intelligence, found evidence of the coffin smuggling operation. Frank still didn't know, was too careful, too smart, but not careful enough, not smart enough, because he'd broken his own rule. He'd been seen. January 28th, 1975, 4:47 a.m. Frank's front door exploded inward. DEA agents, NYPD, federal marshals, 30 men in tactical gear screaming, guns drawn. Frank was in bed. Julie screamed. Their children woke up crying. Frank knew immediately this wasn't a shakedown. This wasn't a mistake. This was the end. They found everything. Cash in the walls, product in the basement, records, names, evidence of the entire operation. Frank was arrested. So were his brothers, his cousins, his whole organization, all at once. Coordinated raids across 3 states. The Blue Magic Empire fell in a single morning. At the precinct, Richie Roberts sat down across from Frank, put a folder on the table, opened it. Inside was a photograph, Frank in his chinchilla coat, ringside at Madison Square Garden, March 8, 1971. "This is where it started," Richie said. "This is when we knew." Frank stared at the photograph, at himself, at that coat, at the biggest mistake of his life. "I wore a coat," he said quietly. "You wore a $50,000 coat to the biggest fight in history, sat ringside, got your picture taken, showed everyone who you were. I thought I was invisible. You were, until you weren't, until you wanted to be somebody, and that's when we got you." Frank closed his eyes. All those years of discipline, of strategy, of staying in the shadows, destroyed by one night of ego, one decision to be seen. Richie leaned forward. "You know what's funny? We'd been investigating Harlem's drug trade for years, had files on Nicky Barnes, on all the big players. Your name never came up, not once. You were a ghost. You could have kept going forever. But I wore the coat." But you wore the coat. Frank was charged with federal drug trafficking, state charges, RICO violations, enough to put him away for 70 years. His lawyers told him he had one option: cooperate, give up his suppliers, his corrupt cops, his whole network. Frank refused at first. He wasn't a snitch, wasn't going to betray the code. But then his lawyers explained something. His wife could be charged too, his mother. His children could go into foster care. That changed everything. Frank had built his empire to protect his family, to give them the life he never had, and now that empire was going to destroy them. Frank Lucas made a deal. He gave up everyone, his suppliers in Southeast Asia, the corrupt DEA agents, the NYPD detectives on his payroll. Over 75 people went to prison because of Frank's testimony. He served only 5 years, got out in 1981, went into witness protection with his family. The Blue Magic Empire was gone. The money was gone, seized by the government. His reputation was destroyed. He was known as a snitch, a rat. But his family was safe. That's what mattered to him. Years later, in 2007, Denzel Washington played Frank in the movie American Gangster. The fur coat scene was in it. Hollywood made it look glamorous, made Frank look like a boss. But the real Frank Lucas watched that scene differently. He saw his biggest mistake immortalized on screen, saw the moment his pride became his downfall. A reporter asked him about it after the movie came out. "Do you regret wearing the coat?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Every single day for the last 30 years. That coat cost me $50,000, but it really cost me everything. My freedom, my empire, my reputation, all because I wanted to be seen, wanted to prove I was somebody." If you could go back, would you do it differently? I wouldn't have gone to the fight at all, would have stayed home, would have stayed invisible, would have remembered that the moment people see you, they can destroy you. What's the lesson? Frank thought for a long time. Pride comes before the fall. Every gangster movie says it. Every wise guy knows it, but knowing it and living it are different things. I knew it. Bumpy taught me, but I let my ego win for one night, and that one night ended everything. The chinchilla coat that destroyed Frank Lucas's empire ended up in an evidence locker. Eventually, it was auctioned off. Some collector bought it for $35,000. Frank Lucas died in 2019, natural causes, old age. He'd outlived almost everyone from his era. At his funeral, someone asked his son what his father's biggest regret was. "The coat," his son said without hesitation. He talked about it all the time, said it was the stupidest thing he ever did. Said if young dealers asked him for advice, he'd tell them this: stay invisible. The moment you want people to see you, you've already lost. That's the real story of Frank Lucas's fur coat. Not a story of triumph or success, a story of ego, of pride, of one catastrophic decision that proved something every criminal eventually learns. You can be smart, you can be strategic, you can build an empire, but the moment you forget the rules, the moment you think you're untouchable, the moment you let vanity win, that's when it all falls apart. Frank Lucas made $1 million a day for 5 years, built one of the most successful drug operations in American history, and destroyed it all because he wanted to look good at a boxing match. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Frank Lucas stories Hollywood doesn't show you, the mistakes, the consequences, the real lessons from the streets. Drop a like if you think Frank should have stayed home that night. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever made a decision you regretted immediately? What happened? More untold stories dropping next. Don't miss it.